At the Supreme Court in Washington, one of the ways they have mitigated some of the physical risk that the justices may face there is that they have surrounded the United States Supreme Court building itself with a very large physical buffer zone. This is an aerial view of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. The front entrance to the Supreme Court is these big grand doors that make you feel like you're entering at least a great scene in a movie or maybe heaven itself. Those grand, awe-inspiring doors are closed now permanently for security reasons. They've got a much piddlier little entrance that you have to go through now to get into the court, sort of on the side, the side of the front of the court. But in order to even get to that little piddly entrance, in order to get even anywhere near it, you have to cross this grand marble public plaza outside the Supreme Court. It's like 100 feet by 250 feet, this big oval-shaped plaza. And the Supreme Court has decided for itself that the whole public plaza, that whole big marble expanse, is a safety zone. It's a buffer zone. You cannot be there. You cannot walk across it if you need to get somewhere. But no matter how strong your feelings are about something going on or being debated or decided at the Supreme Court, you can't protest on that plaza. You can't hang around on that plaza. It must be nice for the people who work there, right? I mean, yeah, there are lots of protests whenever the Supreme Court's in session, protests on both sides of a lot of the cases that Supreme Court hears. People are sometimes getting arrested at those protests. Tensions are high. Sometimes it's a lot of people protesting. Sometimes it's a lot of people protesting in a way that is purposely trying to be intimidating to people around them. It must be nice. If you work at that court, have a little breathing room from that. You can safely get in and out of your workplace without either the intimidation fears or the safety fears or just the hassle or the stress. I mean, for the people who are responsible for keeping the justices themselves safe, it must be a great relief to them to have that buffer zone outside that courtroom, that no protest zone. The Supreme Court has also upheld buffer zones, no protest zones outside polling places. On Election Day, you can do all sorts of things to make your political preferences known beyond just voting yourself. You can try to persuade people to vote the way you want them to vote. You can hold signs, hold demonstrations. You can yell at people. You can hold publicity stunts. You can reason with people and try to persuade them to do what you want to do. But you can't do any of that inside the polling place. Or in most places, you can't do any of that anywhere near the polling place. Yes, you have First Amendment rights, even on Election Day, but you cannot exercise your First Amendment rights to protest and to agitate and to do other things you might be able to do elsewhere. You can't exercise those rights inside the buffer zone, the sort of no protest zone, the no politicking zone that exists on Election Day around our polling places. The Supreme Court also, not that long ago, specifically affirmed no protest zones, buffer zones, around military funerals. If you are someone who believes that the best use of your time is to protest at the funerals of American service members, for whatever reason, there are people who believe that, well, the Supreme Court affirmed in 2011 that you do have the right to do that. However odious your speech is, you have a right to that speech. But the loved ones of this fallen service member, they also have a right not to be harassed and terrorized as they attend the funeral of that person who they loved. And so a no protest zone, a buffer zone, can be established at those kinds of events. And yes, the First Amendment survives even that. I mean, the Supreme Court, in its own interest, and in the interest of these other settings and activities, they have been able to see that the First Amendment can be protected and respected alongside protection and respect for other things that people have a right to do. After all these murders and shootings and people bolting their necks into I-beams to block access to abortion clinics over the past 20 or 25 years, to terrorize and kill people who work at those clinics, cities and states around the country have tried to find that same balance as well. In 2000, the Supreme Court upheld a Colorado rule that calls for basically an 8-foot bubble around anybody going into a health clinic. It's not a fixed space. It's basically an imaginary bubble that moves with you, where people can't get closer to you than 8 feet if you don't want them to, if you're trying to get into a clinic. They can still scream at you and show you pictures you don't want to see and berate you and all the other stuff they may want to do, but they can't physically get closer to you than 8 feet. In Massachusetts, where they had those murders in Brookline, the 2 people killed and the 5 people wounded in that onslaught that day. In Massachusetts, they tried their own Massachusetts version of that Colorado law, but the protests were so vociferous Local police said it was not a workable law for them. In testimony before the Massachusetts legislature, 7 years into Massachusetts trying to enforce their version of the sort of bubble law, the man who's now Boston's commissioner of police told the legislature that the floating bubble law was basically impossible for police to enforce outside Massachusetts clinics. He said, I like to make the reference of basketball referee down there. We're watching feet, watching hands. He said it was impossible to enforce. That year that he made that testimony, in 2007, Massachusetts changed its law basically to make the whole thing simpler. And in Massachusetts now, there is a yellow line painted on the ground outside clinic entrances. It marks a fixed zone, a fixed space, 35 feet from the clinic entrance, that is basically a no protest zone, a bubble, like you've got around polling places, like you've got around military funerals, like the justices of the Supreme Court enjoy every day. And that fixed zone was designed to keep those clinic entrances open and the people going in and out of those clinics safe after decades of murder and mayhem outside clinics just like that. Well, today the Supreme Court overturned that Massachusetts law. From inside their own protective buffer zone, the Supreme Court issued its majority ruling, striking down the one outside abortion clinics. The ruling, written by Chief Justice John Roberts, chastises Massachusetts for trying to stop these petitioners who simply, quote, wish to converse with their fellow citizens about an important subject on the public streets and sidewalks.